She walked into the bank with hands that trembled, clutching a letter no one wanted to read, an elderly widow dismissed by a system she once trusted. Most people looked away. One man didn't. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her past, but something in her posture, dignified, quiet, familiar, ignited a fire he thought the war had buried. What happened next began as a silent act of defiance and ended with a four-star general walking through the door. This isn't just a story about bureaucracy. It's a story about what happens when one person refuses to stay silent, when one moment of courage changes everything. And it all started with one choice: to step out of line. Now, let me tell you what happened that day. Daniel Brooks pushed open the glass doors of First National Bank on a warm Thursday morning. The Florida sun glinted off the brim of his worn baseball cap, the same cap his father used to wear before he left for his final deployment overseas. To most, it was just another old hat. But for Daniel, it was a tether to a memory blurred by time and tragedy. 6 months had passed since his honorable discharge from the Army. The transition to civilian life wasn't easy, but it was steady. He'd picked up work as a plumber, honest labor that allowed him to solve problems with his hands, to restore order where chaos crept in. He liked that. It made sense. Pipes leaked, you fixed them. Simple. But not everything could be fixed so cleanly. There were wounds buried deeper, ones he rarely talked about, even to himself. He still carried the weight of a war he hadn't fought with weapons. The war his mother fought after his father died in Afghanistan when Daniel was just 7 years old. A Marine sergeant was gone in an instant. Daniel's memories of him were few, more feelings than images, like the sound of boots on the floor, or the scent of engine oil mixed with aftershave. What he remembered most, though, was what came after. His mother, suddenly a widow, had become a quiet warrior in her own right. He'd watched her in government buildings, in cold waiting rooms, sitting across desks from indifferent officials who barely looked her in the eye. She never raised her voice, but Daniel could always sense when she was holding back tears. The dismissals were never cruel, just routine, bureaucratic, painless for the people giving them, and devastating for the ones receiving them. During the ones' returns for the ones receiving them, those moments shaped him. They planted something in his chest, a vow, even if unspoken. If he ever saw someone else being treated the way his mother was, he wouldn't just stand by. This morning his mission was simple: pay the rent on time, a small ritual he'd come to respect since returning home. It gave structure and reliability. He didn't trust mailing checks. There was something about handing it over in person that felt more real. As he stepped into the short line at the teller window, he scanned the room out of habit, an instinct left over from years overseas. That's when he noticed her. An elderly woman stood at the customer service desk. She looked to be in her late 70s, maybe older. Her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. She wore a pale cardigan despite the mild spring heat outside, and clutched a document in slightly trembling hands. Her posture was unmistakable, upright but tired, like someone who'd learned how to stay composed through decades of being told to wait, to try again, to come back later. "Ma'am, I've explained this 3 times already," the young bank employee said, her voice tinged with thinly veiled impatience. "The system shows no error. The fee was applied correctly." The older woman's voice was quiet but steady. "But this letter says otherwise. My husband's military pension account isn't supposed to have these charges. It's protected." The employee barely looked at the paper. "The computer doesn't show any special status. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, but she didn't sit, didn't walk away. Dignity held her up like scaffolding. Daniel watched, heart beginning to thud heavier in his chest. That posture, he knew it. His mother had stood the same way more times than he could count. Then came a voice from the line behind him. "Some people just don't get how lines work," a young man muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Daniel turned slightly. The man was checking his watch, irritated, exasperated. A few others averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the pattern on the carpet. No one said anything, no one stepped forward. But Daniel couldn't forget the look in his mother's eyes on the days when no one did. And so without fanfare or drama, he took a breath. and stepped out of line. Daniel's boots moved before his thoughts caught up, one step, then another. The simple act of walking those few feet toward the customer service desk felt heavier than it should have, like stepping into something he couldn't undo. He reached the woman's side and placed a steady hand on her shoulder, not intruding, just anchoring her. The gesture made her flinch at first. Then she turned, eyes softening with cautious surprise. The bank employee looked up, blinking in confusion. "Sir, this matter doesn't involve you." Daniel's voice was calm, firm. "Actually, it does." He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. His time in uniform had taught him how to project authority without aggression. It wasn't about volume, it was about conviction. This woman deserves to be treated with respect. She's not asking for special treatment, just fairness. The employee's face flushed slightly, but her tone stayed defensive. "Sir, I'm following protocol. Our system doesn't show any military exemption." Daniel remained beside the woman. "Her name is Mrs. Carter, and she's presenting official documentation from the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's not a random printout. It's the law." The older woman looked up at him again, this time with something stronger than surprise, recognition. "Thank you, young man," she said with a slight southern drawl and a steel edge beneath the warmth. "But you don't need to trouble yourself." "It's no trouble, man," Daniel replied without looking away from the bank employee. She extended her hand. Helen Carter, widow of Colonel James Carter, 1st Infantry Division. He was killed in Iraq 15 years ago now. Daniel took her hand in his and felt the faint strength in her grip. "Daniel Brooks, former Army, 10th Mountain Division." Her eyes lit with familiarity. "Oh, my James trained some of your officers, I believe." Behind them, someone from the line scoffed again. "Oh, come on. This guy's trying to be Captain America or something. We've got jobs to get to." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Most didn't meet Daniel's eye. Jennifer, the customer service rep, looked flustered now. "Sir, we have procedures. The system overrides letters like this. If there's an issue, she needs to take it up with the VA." Daniel didn't flinch. "That letter is from the VA. You're ignoring what's right in front of you." He glanced at the document again, VACO, military letterhead, legal citations. It was valid, no doubt. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that no one had cared enough to actually read it. No one had paused long enough to see her. By now, a security guard had begun making his way over, careful but alert. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Daniel turned toward him, his expression calm. "No, sir. Just standing with this lady until her situation's handled correctly." The security guard didn't respond immediately. He looked at the faces watching from the line, some anxious, some irritated. Then he looked at Helen, still holding her papers. Then Daniel. He didn't move. Jennifer crossed her arms. "I've done all I can. We have policies." Daniel took a breath. "Let me tell you something about policies. They're supposed to serve people, not erase them." The room was still, and in that silence, Helen placed her hand gently on Daniel's arm. "You remind me of James," she whispered. "He never let people be forgotten." It hit Daniel harder than he expected. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this wasn't just about a bank fee, not anymore. It was about how we treat the people who carried this country forward, and the quiet ones they left behind. And as long as she stood there alone, he would stand there too. The air in the bank shifted. He could feel it. Daniel had stood his ground, but now he was becoming something else, an unwelcome disruption, the kind of problem polite society preferred to ignore. Jennifer's voice was clipped as she pushed Helen's paper back across the desk. "I've already explained. You'll need to take it up with the VA. We can't override the system." Helen didn't say a word. Her eyes, tired but steady, held onto her dignity like it was armor. But Daniel could see the resignation behind them, the same look he'd seen in his mother when she realized no one was going to help, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. Before he could respond, a sharp voice rang from the back of the line. "This guy's playing the hero for some old lady," the same man from earlier scoffed. "Some of us have lives." A few others nodded silently, checking their phones, fidgeting, shifting weight from foot to foot. No one said it out loud, but the feeling was clear. This is taking too long. Daniel turned slowly to face them, not with anger, but with a quiet intensity that made a few of them look away. He was about to speak when a man in a tailored suit stepped out from a nearby office, drawn by the tension hanging in the air. His expensive shoes clicked on the tile. He looked mid-40s, confident, distracted, the kind of man who ran meetings with buzzwords and wore a watch that cost more than Daniel's first car. He scanned the room. "What's going on here, Jennifer?" Jennifer straightened immediately. "Just a minor issue with the veteran's widow. The system isn't recognizing a fee exemption." The man turned to Daniel. "Sir, I understand you're trying to help, but this isn't the place to debate VA policies. Mrs. Carter can make an appointment to resolve the matter." Daniel took a breath, then spoke. Calm, clear. "With respect, sir, this isn't about a system glitch. It's about doing the right thing. Right now," the manager's smile stiffened. "Are you suggesting we don't support military families?" "I'm suggesting," Daniel said, locking eyes with him, "that brushing off a widow who served this country in her own way isn't support, it's avoidance." There was a flicker of something in the manager's eyes, maybe offense, maybe guilt. But before he could reply, Helen quietly reached into her purse and slipped a small, worn card into Daniel's hand. He glanced down, the military insignia, the words Charlie Company, 1st Infantry Division. She leaned close and whispered, "It's all right, son. I'm used to this dance by now." That did something to Daniel. He'd spent 18 months in Afghanistan, seen brothers in arms give their lives, and carried their memories home. But this was the kind of battle no one ever talked about. The slow erasure, the casual dismissal. The security guard took a step closer. "Sir, if you're not conducting business, I'll have to ask you to leave." Daniel turned back to Helen. Her eyes said, "You don't have to do this." But that stubborn fire in his chest flared again. "I'm a customer of this bank," he said firmly, "and I choose to stand here until her issue is properly resolved." The manager's face hardened. "Then I'll have to ask you both to leave. We can't allow disruptions to affect other customers." Daniel took a step forward. "Go ahead, call the police. Let them explain why your bank kicked out a military widow over a technicality." It wasn't a threat, it was a truth. And everyone in the room felt it. Jennifer froze. The security guard didn't move. The manager looked suddenly unsure of where to go next. Then Helen, ever composed, began gathering her papers. Her voice was soft but carried clearly. "Very well, I'll wait for your call. Again?" She turned to Daniel and gently squeezed his hand. "Thank you. You remind me that not everyone forgets." Daniel felt something in his chest twist. Anger, yes, but also helplessness. This was what he'd feared most since returning home, the quiet machinery of a system that didn't care who it ran over. Helen leaned in. "My James always said, one person standing for what's right is worth a regiment of those who stand for nothing." He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight. The security guard moved toward the door, wordless, escort mode, no doubt about it. Daniel walked beside Helen, step for step, steady, protective. And just before they reached the glass doors, a sound echoed through the bank. Footsteps, heavy, commanding. Daniel turned and froze. The sound of the footsteps was unmistakable, measured, deliberate, echoing with authority forged from decades of command. The glass doors swung open before Daniel could reach them. And then, silence. Time seemed to still as a tall man stepped inside. Early 60s, dignified, upright, and wearing the full ceremonial dress uniform of a U.S. Army general. 4 silver stars gleamed across his shoulders. Behind him followed 4 officers, each dressed in formal attire, each moving with the quiet confidence of those used to being obeyed. The bank stopped breathing. The security guard froze mid-step. Jennifer sat stiffly behind the desk. Even the smug young man from the line looked up, his expression suddenly unsure. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He stepped slightly in front of Helen, his body placing itself between her and the unknown. A muscle memory, protect first, question later. The general's eyes swept the room, not hurried, not uncertain. He took everything in, and when his gaze landed on Helen Carter, it softened. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice warm, low, and commanding all at once, we've been looking for you. Helen's eyes lit with surprise. General Preston? He smiled. Yes, ma'am. The commanding officer of the Regional Military Command stepped forward and, to the quiet astonishment of every person watching, gently embraced Helen, not out of formality, but like a man greeting family. I'm sorry we're late, he said, pulling back. Traffic was worse than expected. He looked her over with genuine concern. Is everything all right here? The silence that followed was louder than any accusation. Helen started to answer, but she didn't need to. The branch manager, Wilson, rushed forward like a man waking from a fog. His expression was a cocktail of confusion, recognition, and sudden panic. General Preston, he said, voice overly bright. What an honor, truly unexpected. How can First National be of service today? Preston didn't smile. I'm here to escort Mrs. Helen Carter to a memorial dedication ceremony in her husband's honor, but it seems there's something that needs attention first. Helen gently motioned toward Daniel. This young man stood with me when it counted. Preston turned to him, his posture shifting slightly. And you are? Daniel Brooks, sir, former specialist, 10th Mountain Division. Preston extended his hand. Thank you for looking after Mrs. Carter. She's very dear to our military family. Daniel shook his hand, firm but humble. The general then turned, his gaze settling hard on the manager. Perhaps you're unaware of who Mrs. Carter is. Allow me to enlighten you. The entire bank leaned in. No one moved. Helen Carter is not just a military widow, Preston continued. For 37 years, she served beside her husband in training facilities across the country. While Colonel Carter trained our men in combat, Helen counseled thousands of young recruits struggling to adjust. She created family support programs still in use today. One of the officers behind him stepped forward, handing the general a slim folder. When Colonel Carter was killed saving 3 of his men during an ambush in Fallujah, Helen didn't stop serving. She has since volunteered over 15,000 hours at VA hospitals. That pension account you're questioning, it's exempt from fees by personal authorization of the Secretary of Defense. Wilson had turned pale. Jennifer seemed to shrink into her seat. Preston's voice didn't rise, but it landed like a hammer. The funds in question belong to a special pension category designated for families of Medal of Honor recipients. Colonel Carter was awarded that medal posthumously. Gasps rippled softly through the bank. Even Daniel felt something shift in him. He had defended Helen without knowing the full story, but now, understanding who she was, only deepened his resolve. The general wasn't finished. Helen has never once asked for special treatment. She didn't mention her husband's medals or her decades of service. She only asked for what she was due, and she was dismissed. Wilson stammered, General, this was a misunderstanding. I assure you we'll rectify it immediately. Preston narrowed his eyes. No, you'll do more than that. I'm requesting a full audit of how this branch handles veteran accounts. One of my officers will remain here to begin that process today. He turned back to Helen, his tone softening again. The ceremony starts in less than an hour. They're waiting to honor you and Colonel Carter. Helen nodded, her voice catching slightly. I wouldn't miss it for the world. As she moved toward the door with the officers, Preston turned once more to Daniel. Mr. Brooks, he said, would you do us the honor of joining the ceremony? Daniel blinked. Sir? You've shown what it means to stand for someone when no one else would. That's worth recognizing. Daniel swallowed. Yes, sir, I'd be honored. The general then paused beside the impatient young man who had mocked them earlier. Without looking directly at him, Preston spoke enough for everyone to hear. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought overseas, but in ordinary places. And the greatest acts of courage aren't marked by medals, but by the choice to stand when everyone else walks away. No one spoke as the military procession exited the bank. And behind the glass, the people inside watched, some with shame, others with quiet reverence, as Helen Carter was finally escorted with the respect she had always deserved. The ceremony was held beneath a sky so blue it almost didn't seem real. Rows of chairs lined the green lawn outside the regional military memorial, filled with families, service members, and dignitaries. A folded American flag rested on a podium flanked by honor guards. Brass glinted in the sunlight, but it was Helen Carter who shined brightest. She stood at the center, dressed modestly but regal in her composure, as a community honored not just the life of her husband, but her legacy of sacrifice. When General Preston invited Daniel to the stage and introduced him as a man who reminded us all what service looks like beyond the uniform, the crowd stood in quiet recognition. Daniel didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like he had done enough. But Helen took his hand afterward, held it in both of hers, and said softly, "You didn't let me stand alone. That matters more than medals." That moment stayed with him. Long after the ceremony, long after the applause, the cameras, the fading sunlight, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just for Helen, for him. He returned to his modest apartment that evening and found a voicemail on his phone. It was General Preston. "I meant what I said," the message began. "We need people like you, people who understand both sides of the uniform. I'd like to offer you a position as a civilian advisor to our community outreach division." Daniel listened to it twice before he could believe it. He wasn't just being thanked, he was being called back into service, not with weapons or boots or missions, but with purpose, a new kind of mission. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began working with the military's veteran support programs. He helped design new initiatives for smoother transitions back into civilian life. He listened, really listened to soldiers who felt lost, forgotten, discarded, because he had been there and he remembered what it felt like to stand in line, silent, while dignity slipped through the cracks. At headquarters, a photo appeared on the wall. Daniel and Helen standing together at the memorial ceremony. Beneath it, a simple caption: "Sometimes standing still means standing tallest." The image became an unofficial emblem of the new culture taking root within the command, a reminder that strength isn't always loud and that presence can be power. Helen became a regular visitor at Daniel's office. She'd bring cookies, handwritten notes, and gentle advice he didn't know he needed. In time, she filled a quiet space in his life that had been left hollow since his mother passed 2 years earlier. She never tried to replace that loss, but she filled the silence with grace. Through Helen, Daniel connected with older veterans, the ones who rarely spoke but carried entire wars in their eyes. He organized intergenerational meetings where stories were shared, laughter returned, and burdens finally began to lift. Even the bank, the institution that had tried to push Helen aside, wasn't left unchanged. Within a week of the incident, First National issued a formal apology to Helen Carter, but more importantly, they announced a new training program, mandatory sessions for all staff on how to respectfully handle military families' accounts, particularly those under protected pensions. Thomas Wilson, the branch manager, reached out to Daniel personally. "That day shook something loose in me," he admitted during their first meeting. "I've spent years hiding behind procedures instead of standing behind people." To Daniel's surprise, Wilson offered his financial expertise, volunteering to help veterans struggling with debt, budgeting, or navigating complex systems. Jennifer, the young bank rep who had dismissed Helen, sent Daniel a short handwritten note. "I've started seeing people again, not just transactions. That moment changed me." She later became one of the most vocal advocates during the bank's staff training seminars. She stood in front of her peers and told the story, unflinching, honest. "I used to think silence meant efficiency, but silence can be cruelty in disguise. That day taught me that sometimes standing up doesn't mean arguing, it just means not looking away." And the culture at First National began to shift. Not overnight. but steadily. It wasn't just about veterans anymore. It became about anyone who walked in with a story, a struggle, or a need that didn't fit neatly into a policy. As for Daniel, he finally stopped feeling like he was between worlds. He had found a bridge, and he had become it for others. A year passed, not all at once, but in quiet, deliberate steps, like the way a soldier walks through unfamiliar territory, alert, purposeful, never forgetting where they came from. Daniel had long since settled into his new role at the military's Community Outreach Division. He no longer flinched when called sir in passing. He didn't feel like an outsider anymore. Not in uniform, not out of it. Instead, he'd become a voice that bridged two worlds, the one that fights overseas and the one that quietly breaks apart back home. On the anniversary of that day in the bank, Helen walked into Daniel's office holding a small box. He smiled, standing to greet her as always. She handed it to him without ceremony. "Just a little something," she said, brushing off his gratitude before it came. Inside was a simple plaque, dark wood, gold trim. The engraving read, "Sometimes one person standing for what's right is worth 1,000 standing for nothing at all." Daniel traced the words with his thumb quietly. Helen sat across from him, her hands folded on her lap. "You know," she said softly, "I've been through a lot of ceremonies, folded flags, speeches, promises, but nothing ever stayed with me like that moment in the bank." Daniel looked up. "Because you stood with me," she said. "Before the uniforms showed up, before the cameras, before anyone knew who I was, you didn't need a reason. You just saw me." That word landed somewhere deep inside him, because that had always been the missing piece, hadn't it? After the war, after discharge, after structure and clarity were gone, what remained was the fear of becoming invisible, of being a name no one remembered, a number in a file, a polite nod in a crowded room. But that day, in that quiet moment, he had seen someone, and in doing so had been seen in return. He kept the plaque on his desk from that day forward, not for visitors, not for show, just to remind himself that moral courage doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers, "Stay, don't walk away." He shared that truth with new veterans every month, young men and women coming out of service, unsure of their place. He told them stories, not of battlefield glory, but of Helen Carter, of bureaucracy, of a decision to step out of line when everyone else stayed put. "In combat," he said once, standing before a room of tired, skeptical faces, "we stand together because we have to. Out here, we stand together because we choose to." There were nods, not big dramatic ones, but subtle, the kind of nods that meant someone gets it. In time, the story of Daniel and Helen was told in speeches, shared in newsletters, and used in training. But Daniel didn't care about the attention. He cared about something else: impact. At First National, there was now a special protocol in place, flagging veteran accounts for review by human eyes, not just software. Helen's name had quietly become the name of the new program, the Carter Protocol. It wasn't a PR move. It was a promise. Thomas Wilson, the once rigid branch manager, visited Daniel's office occasionally now, not out of guilt, but out of purpose. He had become a teacher, guiding other financial institutions through similar reforms. Jennifer had changed too. She spoke at high schools, community centers, and even at military bases. Her message was always the same: don't confuse silence with respect. Sometimes dignity starts with listening. But for Daniel, the greatest shift was personal. He no longer wondered if he was doing enough. He no longer asked whether what he did mattered, because he had seen it in Helen's smile, in a room full of veterans who stood taller after hearing his words, in every quiet thank you from someone who felt less alone because he stayed. The world still turned, systems still failed, injustices still crept through the cracks, but Daniel had learned something profound. The most powerful moments of resistance don't happen on grand stages. They happen in line at a bank, in the hallway of a hospital, in a waiting room, a classroom, or a grocery store. And when those moments come, they never announce themselves. They just wait silently to see who will stand. And if you stand not for attention, not for reward, but simply because someone is alone, you change everything.